is Sam, and we are here with Blair Taylor, who is the program director at the Institute for Social Ecology. And he's also written an article called Alt-Right Ecology, which appeared in an edited collection that Bernard Fortner, who we had on the show a few episodes back, talking about ecofascism. That collection is called The Far Right in the Environment. The pieces are called Alt-Right Ecology, and I think we're just kind of basically going to go through the argument of what that piece is. In some ways, and this is just kind of on a personal note, I read this article in 2019 when it first came out, and there's a lot of overlap between what we accidentally wrote in our thing without directly realizing that we'd got the ideas from you. So I want to kind of acknowledge that debt and go through those arguments. Towards the end of the article,
yes, that's good. That's the point.
It hadn't occurred to me that kind of 2 years later we would be reconstructing your arguments, but I guess this is independent corroboration. In the article, at the end of the article, you make a series of really good points and trying to situate and kind of read alt-right ecology. And one of the ways in which you do that is by understanding it in relation to neoliberal environmentalism or progressive neoliberalism, with a particular focus on neoliberal environmentalism within that.
Yeah, this ostensibly left constellation. Yeah, well, that is the kind of like the oppositional force they're in many ways trying to fight against. So they're situating themselves against this George Soros-backed, liberal, progressive, identitarian in some ways, although not in the ways they prefer, anti-racist, and ostensibly environmental milieu. So they can position themselves as the true kind of benefactors, the true protectors of the environment. These people are just paying lip service to these environmental ideas, while in fact, enriching their Wall Street plutocratic buddies, fueling this quote unquote empire of nothing. They don't really mean it. And at the same time, they're representatives of the kind of amoral, mongrelizing forces of capitalism, of the environmental destructive nature of capitalism, but also of immigration and multiculturalism, anti-nationalism, cosmopolitanism, all these things that the far right sees as the enemy, as the problem, and that the ecological right gives an explicitly ecological analysis of.
In order to kind of like understand this like empire of nothing, this kind of wasteland in some sense, in which we kind of find ourselves, like a spiritual wasteland, it's interesting because on the one hand, it's possible to read the alt-right, and particularly it's what we might call this kind of tributary cultures, sort of cultures that led into it, as emblematic of a kind of absolute nihilism that, for example, Wendy Brown writes about, and at the same time, through the alt-right in this kind of transformation as you go through the movement from 2016 or 2015 through to, let's say, 2018, when these kind of natural currents start to become more apparent as the kind of the split with Trump happens and so on. That's a kind of drilling down into a kind of forced integrity. And so I'm wondering how, or a kind of forced conviction. We really mean this. No one else really means their politics. And in some sense, the critique of that the far right brings to bear on the rest of politics is that none of it is sincere. It's all various kinds of games and so on. So I was wondering, how do you see that idea of integrity or that idea of sincerity in politics, and the far right's presentation of itself as integrated, serious and so on? How does that interact with its conceptions of nature? Mm-hmm. Is there a link there?
Absolutely. It's the return of the real, and nature is that ultimate real. It's that ultimate underlying realm of natural law. Nature is this timeless realm of competition, of hierarchy, of a brutal struggle for survival, of difference and differentiation of different species, fighting it out. And, all this like liberal hogwash is just, the sediment on top of all this. This is, it's unnatural to just put it in a word. And of course, like the connotations of different groups, whether it's nomadic, immigrant groups, whether it's Jews as kind of these urban sophisticates who have no homeland of their own, et cetera. It's a very useful projection screen for right-wing thinkers, groups, and actors to kind of project onto. And, as I point out in the article, they have a very strong case to make in this regard, as, ecology only became kind of a left-wing discourse in the last 40, 50 years. But prior to that, was very much associated with this kind of like racialized tribalism, social Darwinism, giving all these elements. And that's what I argue in the end of that book chapter. as Wendy Brown kind of posited this relationship between this kind of amoral neoliberalism as kind of, even though it seems on the one hand kind of in tension with or in contradiction with this like robust normative neoconservatism, they actually have kind of a dialectical relationship, and that you eventually need that return of the real. You need that normative substance. You need that meaning, that the kind of Christian millenarian nationalist blah 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 of neoconservatism comes and fills the ethical void that's been hollowed out by neoliberalism. And you can make the same case, I would say, for the kind of like market-based environmentalism of neoliberalism, the carbon credits, tax credits, things like this, that no, we need to go back to this kind of deeper right-wing ecology. So I think there's a lot of relationships between these two. And what I was trying to do is basically update Wendy Brown's argument and looking at the role like alt-right ecology or ecofascism can play a similar role in offering something, as you said, that feels real, that feels substantive, that feels authentic. And this overlaps with all these classic ideas of right-wing thought. Adorno's critique of Heidegger, the jargon of authenticity, and people want this. They feel, rootless. They feel like they're atomized individuals in neoliberalism. So the alt-right can come along and offer them these thick identities, rooted in the land, rooted in nature, rooted in these things that are coded as good. And in many ways, the left actually has played an important role, at least in the last 50 years, in coding them as good, whether that's having an identity, and especially an ethnic identity, being an environmental subject, protecting nature. These things are very, powerful political terrains or categories or values that are up for grabs. They've never been settled, and we've tended to project the last 40, 50 years of political history back further, when in fact these same ideas had both identity and cultural difference on the one hand, and environmentalism had more or less more right-wing assumptions and political trajectories.
Yeah, that's really great. I just occurs to me now that that in some sense the list of things you gave at the beginning, hierarchy and so on, I would add in that there are two different things in there which are kind of contradictory, which is moralism and amoralism, and the tension between moralism and amoralism in far-right thinking in general. And I would suggest, I'm just thinking about it now, so like this is probably a bit too hasty, but I would suggest that in some ways nature is the thing that allows the resolution of that binary.
Yeah,
it is the moral thing that speaks to no moral law or something like this, or it's the amoral thing that speaks to a moral law that is itself amoral, or that is like kind of entirely orthogonal to, or that's a stupid word to use, independent of the morality of humans and so on, and therefore can, in expressions of power, naked, given just like whatever power. Power without reason, in expressions of that power, it can do whatever work you want it to do. It can either express the morality of itself, or it can express the amorality of itself, and it can always be appealed to because it can resolve this contradiction. That stuff about the dialectic of neoconservatism and what Wendy Brown calls the far right, and I think, definitely in this case the alt-right, is really, really fascinating. I'm going to come back to that, but for now, I want to ask you about this contestation of ecology, the contestation of like the idea of ecology, and in particular, what is kind of absent in pretty much all the instances of alt-right ecology that you list, which is climate change. Climate change is the, maybe this is a bit excessive again, but like climate change is the ecological issue of our times. It is what environmentalism means now in this particular conjuncture. And yet it is absent. And so I wanted you to kind of like suggest reasons or like speak to that absence. Why can't it appear? Why is it impossible for there to be, or do you think it is impossible for there to be an alt-right response to climate change?
Definitely not. I think one reason it has been is because, and especially this is in the United States context, it's a little bit different in Europe, is because of that strong background of climate denialism, where it was just seen as a cultural Marxist plot, lie, hoax, whatever, not really a serious concern, not a serious issue, but that's starting to change. I mean, I think in the book chapter, I quote someone basically taking more or less a kind of pluralist agnostic take on the matter that, some people agree it's an issue, other people disagree, but it doesn't matter because ultimately alt-right politics we agree on this and it'll be good for the environment one way or the other. So we don't have to like have a hard line, but I think that's actually been shifting, and it's the farthest right actors and eco-fascist actors, folks affiliated with the base, Atomwaffen division, the people who are paying attention to far right shooters, who have taken on more of that ecological component, and of course they're giving it a racist, exclusionary, anti-Semitic interpretation. So I think that's going to keep changing. Obviously, more and more young people have grown up in a post-climate change world where those things are just accepted facts of the terrain. And you're still always going to have denialists, and that's of course a big part of the conspiratorial worldview of the far right. But I think increasingly people will accept that. I mean, I don't know if our discussion previous is made it into the recording, so I'll just reiterate that where I live in the Pacific Northwest right now, we're going to break all known historical temperature records this week. In fact, today, we're going to have 101 degrees weather, which has never been recorded. And in 2 days, 108 degrees, which is just absolutely, impossible. It's never happened. So they're grappling with that. They're grappling with the same material conditions, and they have to give a certain analysis to it. And, typically it's population, it's immigration, it's general cultural decline, things like that. And I think Europe has been a little bit more, quote unquote, ahead of the curve on this, because perhaps there's less science denialism on the right in some ways. Perhaps it's the openness of the parliamentary system, that it can be a new issue to recruit people in. But like the National Rally in France has made some very clear statements about climate change, and other European groups are. And the further right you get in the American spectrum, the more likely they are to see that as a problem. The more likely they are to, have affinities for people like Ted Kaczynski, who, we need to go off the grid, we need to get back to nature, get back to the land, et cetera. I mean, Atomwaffen division that I mentioned, they hold him up there with, then they're part of their holy trinity. This is Uncle Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. And here's this like guy preparing for collapse, living environmentally sustainably out in the wilderness, and they see him as this kind of like romantic, heroic figure who Ted was right, as their slogan or their hashtag goes.
Yes, I want to kind of think about this Ted Kaczynski appropriation as well. I mean, he's been latched onto as, in some ways, the most extreme figure in what you might think of as a kind of a pantheon of anti-tech radicals. It's a really interesting article, which I'll put in the show notes, trying to trace his intellectual lineage, which came out about a month ago or something like that. It's really fascinating. And then forward from Ted Kaczynski through to this Mexican group called Individuals Tending Towards the Wild, and so on, who in some ways are kind of the inheritors. This is really provocative, and I'm not sure I want to. It's true, but I'm going to say it anyway. Who in some ways the inheritors of a certain kind of misanthropy that comes to predominate in not exclusively in it, but through a tendency called deep ecology, which perhaps you'd like to comment on links between deep ecologists and ecofascists. I feel like those links are more tenuous than most people give them, than state them as. But I've just contradicted that. I've just said they're real. But I'm trying to link towards the ITS and deep ecology, which seems like a reasonable connection. But I think that it's probably not the case that. Anyway, what do you think about this?
I'm less familiar with the ITS case. I mean, I'm aware of the broad brushstrokes, and I know less about their, I guess, intellectual backgrounds. But I would say that maybe the organized, explicit links between deep ecology and the far right are, I wouldn't say tenuous, because you have alt-right.com, you have Countercurrent saying deep ecology is a forerunner to the alt-right. They're very interested, they're paying attention. Pentti Linkola identifies as a deep ecologist, and he's of course a darling of the far right. So I think those links in some ways are quite explicit, but I think the deeper problem is a more subterranean philosophical resonance that makes them prone to right-wing interpretations. And this is something that has been there for a very long time, that the founder of the Institute for Social Ecology, Murray Bookchin, was really among the first to point out. He wrote a book. It was based on I think an in-person debate in 1987 between him and David Foreman, who's the co-founder of Earth First and a self-described redneck for wilderness. He was a Barry Goldwater conservative Republican who then became this environmental activist. But he didn't have a social analysis. And in fact, he prided himself on not having a social analysis. So it wasn't a surprise then in the 80s that, the radical environmental movement associated with Earth First took explicit positions, praising HIV for thinning out the human population, for increased border controls to stop immigration and, quote unquote, overpopulation. And they had this debate where Murray really just kind of pointed out all the racist, sexist, classist assumptions of this ideology. And actually, this was my entry point to social ecology. Growing up in the Pacific Northwest, I was involved with Earth First, forest defense work. And I don't know if I explicitly identify as a deep ecologist, but it was definitely in the milieu, the arrogance of anthropocentrism being a key critical component. And then I read this book and I was like, wow, okay, he just kind of mops the floor with this guy. He really doesn't have a leg to stand on. And so social ecology has been, from a very long, going back to the 70s, Murray was warning against ecofascism and the lifeboat ethics. And he was a very keen analyst of this, whether that was Dave Foreman, whether that was, anarcho-primitivism, and when, quote unquote, green anarchism associated with John Zerzan and the Unabomber, John Zerzan, the main, theorist of anarcho-primitivism, whom Murray Bookchin had really strong polemics with, struck up a friendship with the anti-civilizational, actor of Ted Kaczynski in prison. And he, warned of these, he called it eco-brutalism. He warned of these overlaps between this kind of right-wing lifeboat ethics and the far right. And lo and behold, he was actually quite prophetic in this regard, because now those same far-right actors are interested in Ted Kaczynski, and they're also reading John Zerzan. Alexander Dugin has quoted him. He pops up on the far-right Stormfront website and chats. So it's interesting. Not to say that Zerzan himself is obviously not a right-wing actor. He's an anti-civilizational anarchist, but you see these affinities, this kind of idea of like the need for collapse and the need for rebirth, the need for nature, for et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those things are all there in the ether. And deep ecology, because it's focus, as you said before, it has this undifferentiated understanding of nature and humanity. It's a biocentric ideology where humans have no special point of reference, or they're not up for special consideration. So who are we to save humans, when that could mean why we value human life over the coronavirus or what have you? And this, we see this, another important recent vector is, and we can talk about this later, how COVID-19 has kind of created another vector for nature getting revenge, human hubris, humans and nature living too close in proximity, and bad things ensue, etc.
In the UK, at least, that sticker campaign you're referring to there, about humans are the virus and so on. This was organised by a group in the UK called the 100 Handers, which is essentially a kind of a decentralised stickering network. So the idea is these pictures are posted on a Telegram channel. And then people print out stickers of them, and then those stickers are distributed by people just like randomly, and you're supposed to kind of encounter them slightly in odd places. You encounter them on kind of on a gate as you're kind of walking into like a park or something, and you're in like the bathroom of like a nightclub or something. And the sticker says something either very innocuous or something like obviously racist, and there's a tension between like the really innocuous things and the really obviously racist things. And so what was kind of interesting, I think, about that is that the 100 Handers were very good at mocking at what was at that point in the UK a big surge in environmentalism, but they weren't in any way attempting to contest the politics of ecology directly. They were in some ways trying and muddy the waters of ecology, which I think is a different kind of tactic. And so I think that's at least the kind of productive distinction.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, that's the case where like there's an explicit right-wing actor, but I think those ideas are out there more broadly, and they don't necessarily have to come from the right. The right seizes on them because they realize they have some kind of like resonance power. I mean, I think of an earlier group that was not a right-wing group, but Zero Population Growth, or the Voluntary Human Extinction Movement, which basically had very, very similar language. And it was like, I mean, like many of these groups probably might identify as neither left nor right, but it had I would say it had more purchase on the left. It was like, especially the environmental left, like people were interested in these ideas, and they had very similar statements and stickers even. So it's it's one of those things where you see this kind of discursive resonance between right and left, and that's I think what, you know, Bookchin and others were kind of like warning against. Not that these people are going to become right wingers themselves, or that they were, or there's cooptation, but, you know, this is why you have to pay attention to the kind of philosophical assumptions and the ideas that are animating your politics, because they point in more or less emancipatory directions. And I think he's been proven right in many regards. He even kind of reflected a little bit on this at certain times. I might have come off a little bit too strong in my denunciation of Comrade Foreman, but that's because, you know, I'm old enough to remember the rise of National Socialism. I've seen these blood and soil ideologies come about, and it's not by accident that these things, you know, get combined.
Where do you mean the rise of National Socialism? I mean, I presume you didn't grow up in in Germany in the 1920s.
As Murray Bookchin, and why?
Sorry, yeah.
Dave Foreman, and he was an old leftist. He was very, you know, polemical, and he was a harsh critic of these things, and he, for a good reason. People maybe didn't see it there. I mean, another arena I see where some of these polemics have proven prophetic is that, you know, he was a harsh critic of the kind of neo-spiritualist some versions of like very spiritual ecofeminism, mysticism, anti-rationalism, and the environmental movement. And people are like, why are you so harsh on this? These are like, you know, even if it's just like, you know, maybe slightly annoying new agey woo stuff, it's ultimately harmless. And he said, no, it's actually not harmless. It's like, it's an anti-rational ideology that you can't contest with reason. And in fact, it has a lot to do with, or a lot of resonance with, kind of classical philosophical assumptions of the right and of National Socialism. It's not this, or at least there's intention, this like uber rationalist and this like anti-rationalist component. And you know, you guys have discussed this on your show with the conspirituality episode. And I think, you know, since the rise of the am I spacing the shaman, the alt-right shaman of the
Jacob Chansley.
Yeah, of the insurrection being kind of maybe the symbol of this, and the rise of internet culture, but this kind of widespread irrationalism that, you know, I think for at least 40 years since like the New Left, this kind of like critique of instrumental reason and rationality was associated with the left and progressive forces, and the right was, you know, the man in the white lab coat, reason, science, enlightenment, etc. And now those categories are troubled and muddied. And I think this is another way that Murray was kind of like right. He kind of foresaw that this critique of this throwing the baby of reason out with instrumental rationality opened the way to all kinds of mystical irrationalities that can't be challenged and that often go in hierarchical, violent, you know, problematic directions.
Yeah, I mean, and this kind of story plays out like again and again, right? Even amongst totally different groups. Like, so, for example, Bruno Latour, right, spent his life in the kind of 80s and 90s critiquing science, and then right to the end of the 90s, this thing called "Why Critiquers Ran Out of Steam," and in which he basically discusses, oh God, I've got to the point at which I'm agreeing with the climate deniers because I'm like trying to investigate the process of science construction and so on.
Yeah.
And so there's I hasten to call it. I'm trying not to call it rather a dialectic, but there's definitely some sort of like movement between these two kind of rationalist, irrationalist poles. Yeah. This is an anti-fascist podcast nominally, so I have to ask you about that kind of thing in relation to what you were just talking about with Ted Kaczynski, because you quoted a line. Ted was right. Which is a very common hashtag in these spaces, but it's also a line that is quoted by people who I don't think I would identify as far right. And in some sense, I think this is where the kind of ADL, SPLC, anti-racism stuff goes. That's the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center, where that stuff goes kind of wrong in trying to identify some of the symbols that it says, okay, these symbols are racist, this symbol is racist, this symbol is racist, and so on. In the UK, we have Hope Not Hate that does essentially that same kind of work.
Right.
Partially because in this exact case, many of the people who are my age and younger, actually a lot younger than me, I don't know why I'm pretending that I'm younger than I am, like a lot younger than me, like 15, 16, 17, 18, who are using these phrases, identify very strongly with the phrases, but would find all the things about racism and this kind of thing that define far-right politics totally alien to them.
Right.
And in that sense, there's a kind of real ambiguity for anti-fascism about like, how do we approach these people who are kind of using the tools of fascist rhetoric and so on, but actually don't really identify with any of these things, and in fact see the anti-civilizational stuff as a kind of anti-racist drive, as at least John Zerzan did as well at the beginning of his trajectory through this stuff. Does that have any purchase on left strategy, do you think? Or how do we approach these things as in terms of left strategy? Or is it that the problem is anti-fascism is a blunt instrument for a much more nuanced collection of problems?
Yeah, that's a complicated question, a tough nut to crack. I mean, obviously symbols and thinkers are up for, grabs, and they're open to interpretations. And I mean, when I was growing up, it was very much Kaczynski was a figure of the left and the environmental scene, and especially the kind of like, eco-anarchist milieu, and he was kind of the hero, which is why Zerzan, had this affinity and struck up a friendship with him. And then, yeah, it's been very interesting to see it being taken up by the right. And it's interesting to hear from you that, relatively, I don't know if apolitical is the right word, but that having resonance with young people who would reject the racism, but embrace the kind of, reject modernity, whatnot. And I think that's maybe also like a new kind of like cultural backdrop for these discussions, is the kind of, we might call it some kind of the capitalist realism of the current present, or this idea that we can imagine, whether it's Jameson, Zizek, whoever, that we can better imagine the end of the world than a minor change to capitalism. And obviously far right environmentalists, but also left environmentalists for many years, they're preparing for this supposedly inevitable social and ecological collapse that'll create this, alternately lawless world, or whether you see that as a good or a bad thing, where real men or decentralized communities can restart the world, as they see it as an opening, and a lack of faith that real change is possible. So that collapse, or that escape that Kaczynski represents, is a really powerful romantic urge and longing. And it's like, it also appeals to this Western individualism of like the lone heroic man fighting with nature against this, corrupt, decadent modern society. And I think you see it too now, like with what's his name, both Epstein and then McAfee, this like the conspiratorial worldview of like, these people were right, that the system is like, trying to get rid of them because they spoke truth, even if they were problematic in various ways. They're the lone just figure fighting heroically against a corrupt system. And to me, this also, again, just goes back to the need for like theoretical precision and philosophical interrogation of our ideas. And this is, again, what has always drawn me to social ecology, whether that's in our critiques of capitalism, in our critiques of environmental problems, in our critiques of racism, that whatever it is, our understandings of nature, that, we have to think carefully about these things because of these, unwanted bedfellows, or because it could push us in trajectories that really are problematic or are anti-emancipatory. So I think that also speaks to the kind of like intellectual degradation of the age in some ways, to borrow from one of those right-wing, those tropes that, the meme culture, conspiracy culture, internet culture, it's obviously not in many ways geared towards like a real fine-tuned analysis. So these like the blunt power, as you said, of like a meme or of a Ted was right, it's just like, it's a moral stance and you don't have to really unpack it. So it's very open to left and right interpretations.
Yes, it's with my kind of Adorno hat on, it's a insufficiently determinate negation. I'm going to cut that out. That's a stupid thing to say.
No, keep it that's part of the problem. I mean, here, like, I lived in Germany for quite a few years, and here we were reading like, maybe John Zerzan if you're on the far intellectual wing, but whatever, Chomsky, Zinn, punk rock, the kind of political culture of politicization, I guess, at least in my youth, was fairly, whatever, unsophisticated. But in Germany, they're reading Adorno at 15, 16. So it's a different set of assumptions, and the trajectory is a little different.
What were you? Sorry, just going to go back a bit. What were you talking about with Epstein and McAfee? What have you seen about them?
I just see a lot of like, people in my lefty social milieu also kind of sharing, sometimes tongue in cheek, like Ben Garrison cartoons about, the deep state taking both of them out because they spoke truth to power. But I also think there is like a certain kernel to it of the people posting it, at least, that kind of believes that, I guess. And that this like, or maybe another one, those are obvious examples of, two people who supposedly killed themselves, but Hunter Biden, like, you know, the lone man who's like kind of like fighting against the world, just the authenticity. They're authentic actors, I guess. And again, that's something I think that for, you know, from the New Left until at least the 90s was in many ways coded as a left liberal rebellious posture. And obviously, like, that's Angela Nagel's point in Kill All Normies, is that the right has taken on this oppositional, you know, authentic rebellious culture. And I mean, that ultimately has, I would say, has no meaning anymore. It's not any kind of a stable political trajectory. And that people like, you know, Thomas Frank have been making that point for 30 years, that counterculture and this like antinomian opposition to the status quo itself, you know, it's a F you dad politics, where you don't have like a consistent set of norms that you're acting on. It's always reactionary, and we're seeing that very clearly now. Who are the real rebels? I mean, there was this guy actually last night. I was having dinner with a friend who had like it was a white dude with dreadlocks and like a Molotov cocktail in the t-shirt. And I was really trying to like guess what their politics were, because like I had a strong sense this person was a right-winger actually. But you know, on the outside in the 1990s or 2000s, that would have been a very different thing. I don't know.
It's extraordinary, isn't it, that the symbols of radicalism have moved from, you know, a t-shirt with a snake on it to like Ted was right, or like a swastika or something, right? This kind of extraordinary transformation. Who
are the real insurrectionists?
Well, this is the question. I mean, so in some ways, like, this is the question. As I was saying before, like, there is a negation in saying Ted was right. And I wonder if we kind of, you know, dim reflection of